Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and in this episode, I'll be covering one of my favorite movies of all time, Dances with Wolves. This is an American epic that truly deserves the name epic. The first time I watched this film as a kid, it captured my imagination and instilled in me a fascination I've carried with me ever since of Native American history. The story of Dances with Wolves is about a lieutenant called John J. Dunbar who was posted out on the frontier during the American Civil War. It's there that he comes into contact with a band of Lakota Sioux, and over the course of the film he establishes a relationship with them, eventually even be accepted as one of their own. All the while at the back of his mind he is aware that the Sioux and their way of life will soon be under threat. And if this story sounds at all familiar to you, then it's probably because of other movies like The Last Samurai or Avatar, but in my opinion, this is the film that did it right the first time. But enough of me rambling, let's instead dive right in. Over the course of this review, I'm going to be discussing the historical setting of the film, how historically accurate it is, and in great detail explore the history of the Sioux. This is Dances with Wolves. The story of Dances with Wolves begins in 1863, during the American Civil War. The main protagonist is a lieutenant in the Union Army, John J. Dunbar. For his heroic action in a battle in Tennessee, he is awarded a citation and a military posting of his choosing.
Actually, sir, I'm here at my own request.
Really? Why?
I've always wanted to see the frontier.
You want to see the frontier?
Yes, sir. Before it's gone.
Now, what does Dunbar mean by this exactly? What was the frontier and why was it disappearing? Well, by 1863, the east coast of the United States had been fully settled and the eyes of the American people civilized. But the same could not be said for the great interior that separated the east coast from the west. Much of it was still untouched. 500,000 square miles of grassland known as the Great Plains stretched all the way from Canada right down to Texas, almost entirely covered with nothing much more than prairie. Just like you see here, from horizon to horizon, it was an ocean of grass, and Dances with Wolves absolutely nails the scope of the Great Plains with its cinematography. The panoramic shots we see in the movie are easily reminiscent of other great epics, such as Lawrence of Arabia. Now today, most of the Great Plains has been cultivated into farmland, but there are still some places where you can go to see what it used to look like, and these were some of the locations used in the film. Now, a great feature of this once incredible landscape were the massive herds of migrating buffalo. Around 30 million of them roamed across the prairie. These herds were so big that they literally stopped trains in their tracks for 2 days as they passed through. They were so massive that they would tear the land up during their stampedes.
A gigantic swath of torn up ground extending to the horizon. The sheer numbers it took to create this impossible image was hard to imagine.
For thousands of years, the prairie provided the perfect feeding ground for the buffalo, creating a symbiotic relationship. Seeds from the very grass they grazed upon would cling to the buffalo's shaggy coat. Over the seasons, the herds would migrate across the North American continent, propagating the land where they went. Now, right up into the early 1800s, the Great Plains were, for the most part, unknown and untouched. But it wasn't uninhabited. It was populated by Native Americans from many different tribes. Altogether, they make up the Plains Nations. Just to name a few, there was the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, and of course, the Sioux. Each tribe had its own language, their own unique culture and traditions. But the biggest thing they all shared in common was the buffalo they hunted. It was what drew the tribes to live on the plains and provided for them clothing, shelter, tools, and food. Now, before horses came into the picture, Native Americans had to hunt the buffalo on foot, which was an extremely long and dangerous process. In order to get close to the herd, they would cover themselves with animal skins. They would crawl along the ground, patiently stalking their prey. They would then either ambush individual buffalo, or, with careful timing, they would drive herds into traps or off the edges of corrals and cliffs. This was the way many of the original inhabitants of the plains hunted for thousands of years. But then everything changed in the 1600s when the Spanish reintroduced horses to North America. It pretty much revolutionized their entire society overnight. On horseback, they were able to cover much wider range. They could follow the herds as they migrated, and they were able to kill the buffalo much more efficiently. And you could see here in the film's buffalo hunt sequence, they did a phenomenal job of showing us what it actually used to look like. They used Native American stuntmen who were riding bareback and firing their arrows as they're galloping behind the herd, exactly the same way how their ancestors used to. Another cool thing I like to mention is that they used 3,000 buffaloes for the set piece. I can't even begin to imagine how nerve-wracking it must have been shooting all of this. Because once 3,000 buffaloes start running, it's kind of hard to make them stop. You have to remember that these are the largest animals in North America, and they can weigh over 2,000 pounds or 900 kilograms. But regardless of the safety hazards or the logistical nightmare this had to have been, it was absolutely worth it. When I watch this scene, I get goosebumps and I just sit back in awe. So anyway, like I was saying before, it was the reintroduction of the horse that changed everything. Now presented with new hunting possibilities and countless herds of buffalo, tribes from all directions poured into the Great Plains and made it their home. Many of these tribes would abandon farming and village life to become nomadic horsemen, including one of the most famous of all the Plains Indians, relative newcomers to the scene who arrived in the Great Plains in the 18th century, the Sioux. Collectively, they make up the Great Sioux Nation, and in their tongue, they are known as Achetisacoan, which means 7 council fires. It's a confederation of allied bands made up of 3 different groups, Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. The ones in Dances with Wolves are Lakota, and the movie makes a great effort to authentically portray them. The costumes, for example, are based on actual historical accounts and made out of the same materials that the Lakota would have used.
These costumes were all hand-designed, all done with natural tanned leather, stuff like that. Natural tanned buffalo hide, and the smell of the natural tan stuff, it's intoxicating, it's wonderful.
The teepees are made out of buffalo hides, their shade and color is accurate, the size of the camp is also correct for how large this particular subtribe is, and the film also gives us an idea of just how mobile Sioux camps and villages were. How at the drop of a hat they could just pick up and go.
In the time it took to gather my things at Sedgwick, the entire tribe was well on its way. The efficiency of the people and the speed at which they moved was enough to impress any military commander.
But aside from the costumes, the sets, and the buffalo, what the film really deserves credit for in its mission for authenticity is recreating the Lakota language, which, unfortunately, is in its heyday. Only a few thousand people today are still fluent in it. Certainly none of the cast or extras could speak it because many of them were from different tribes which speak different languages. The woman who made it all possible is the late Doris Leadercharge. Before Dances with Wolves, she worked at a community college in the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, teaching Lakota language and culture. Due to her experience as a college professor, she became the dialogue coach for the entire cast. In fact, in the movie, she has a small speaking part as Pretty Shield, the wife of Chief Ten Bears. Now, I'm sure that under Doris's supervision, the cast did a bang-up job in speaking Lakota, but I wouldn't be surprised if their pronunciation wasn't spot on all the time, which is completely understandable. I mean, after all, they aren't really Lakota. But in this quick scene, we can hear 100% authentic Lakota being spoken by Doris Leadercharge. And what's really beautiful to think about is that now it's forever preserved in this film.
She didn't let her language die, and her spirit lives on, both in this film and in the people that she's touched. She ensured for her people that her language would live on in this movie, and she ensured for herself that her presence will never die.
So now that I've given you a fair idea of what the frontier was like and how much of an amazing place it was, we can now go into some detail about what Dunbar was talking about wanting to see the frontier before it's gone. You see, the reason why the Great Plains hadn't really been settled yet was because it wasn't much of a desirable location. There was very little water or trees around, just endless prairie. And then there's of course the crazy freaky weather. Aside from scorching summers and freezing winters, the Great Plains also were home to some of the worst thunderstorms on Earth, with violent tornadoes ripping through the land. Most pioneers avoided the idea of settling the plains altogether, and in huge numbers passed right through in search of greener pastures, so to speak. They instead had their eyes upon the western coast, like California and Oregon, where good farmland could be found. On May 22, 1843, roughly 1,000 emigrants departed from Elm Grove, Missouri on wagon trains pulled by oxen. Their destination was western Oregon. Their 2,000-mile journey would take them right through the Great Plains and lasted between 4 to 6 months. This year was to be dubbed the Great Migration of 1843. As the years went on, more and more wagon trains followed, trailblazing through the famous route that was to be known as the Oregon Trail. However, things really began to pick up in numbers when in January 1848, James Marshall discovered gold in the Sierra Nevada, sparking off the California gold rush. In staggering numbers, prospectors flooded the Great Plains to seek their fortune in California. Within the first 20 months, 100,000 would travel along the Oregon Trail, and many more would follow, even after the California gold rush ended in 1855. Between 1841 and 1866, 350,000 people would pass through the Great Plains. So it's no surprise in Dances with Wolves that numbers such as these would weigh heavily on Dunbar's mind.
We talk every day, but I know Kicking Bird is frustrated with me. He always wants to know how many more white people are coming. I tell him that the white people will most likely pass through this country and nothing more. But I am speaking in half-truths. One day there will be too many, but I cannot bring myself to tell him that.
The half-truths he's speaking of was just when the pioneers were using the Oregon Trail to get to the West Coast. But he clearly knows that things aren't going to stay that way for very long, that one advantage the Great Plains had was its lack of natural resources to make it an attractive place to settle. But that was soon to change. By 1863, the Transcontinental Railway was being constructed, one that would connect the East Coast to the West and seriously cut down the time it would take to travel the distance. Whereas the wagon train would take 6 months, by train it would take 6 days, and would bring with it all the essential supplies pioneers would need to settle the Great Plains. It was finally finished on May 10, 1869. Aside from the railway, there was one other thing Dunbar neglected to mention to Kicking Bird. On May 20th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Homestead Act. The act encouraged any farmer over the age of 21 to move out west with their family and claim 160 acres of free federal land. All the settlers had to do was pay a small fee, live on the property for 5 years, and, if their farm was successful, then it was theirs. By the end of the Civil War, 15,000 homesteads would be claimed, with much more to follow once the railway had been completed. Eventually, that number would rise up to 1.6 million and would cover 420,000 square miles. As I said before, I really do love Dances with Wolves. It's one of my favourite films of all time, but even I have to admit that there are some inaccuracies in it that need to be mentioned. So first off, I'm going to begin with some interesting things that caught my attention with the characters during my research, and then later I'll move on to the inaccuracies. Now, I'm aware that Dances with Wolves is based on the book of the same name, written by Michael Blake, who also wrote the screenplay for the movie. It's a great piece of historical fiction, and it doesn't pretend to be based on any true events. Nevertheless, I thought it was worth trying to see if any of the characters of the movie are based on real historical figures. It was a complete shot in the dark, but funnily enough, I actually came up with some results. For example, when I looked up the character of Kicking Bird, I actually discovered that there was a Kicking Bird, but unlike his movie counterpart, he wasn't Lakota Sioux. He was a high chief of the Kiowa tribe based out of Oklahoma. There was also a real-life 10 Bears, but just like Kicking Bird, he wasn't Lakota Sioux either. He was a principal chief of the Comanche. And I was able to find mention of a real John Dunbar, but he wasn't a Civil War vet who lived amongst the Lakota Sioux, but instead he was a missionary who lived amongst the Pawnee. So what do these historical figures have to do with the movie? Absolutely nothing. Like, either this is the biggest coincidence I've ever discovered during my research, or Michael Blake just randomly picked 3 names from a history book. However, I'm not insinuating that these are inaccuracies, I just thought it was funny to point out. But in any case, there is at least one character in the movie that is loosely based on a real person, and that is Stands with a Fist. For those of you who haven't seen Dances with Wolves, she is the white adopted daughter of Kicking Bird. In a flashback sequence, we see her family get slaughtered by the Pawnee. She's able to escape, and then later we find out that she was rescued by the Lakota and became part of their tribe, speaking their language, adopting their culture, and, in the process, losing her identity as a white American. Now, this was generally common practice amongst Plains Indians. They kidnapped women and children to replenish their numbers in order to ensure their survival as a group, and they would assimilate and become part of the tribe. Like I said, this happened all the time. Now, just coming back to Stands with a Fist, her character is based on the true story of Cynthia Ann Parker. On May 19, 1836, in Fort Parker, Texas, a war party of Comanche and their native allies attacked Cynthia's community when she was around 10 years old. With most of her family slaughtered, Cynthia was taken captive by the Comanche and lived with them for 24 years. Like Stands with a Fist, she was adopted by the Comanche and became a full member of their tribe. She married a chief and bore him 3 children, one of which was the last free Comanche chief, Quanah Parker. So that takes care of the characters. Now let's get into the inaccuracies. They mostly have to do with the scenes when Dunbar starts interacting with the Sioux.
I believe I made an even greater impression on their next visit. I produced a coffee grinder, something none of them had seen before.
Now, I'm sorry to say this, but I have a little bit of a hard time in believing that these guys have never seen or tasted coffee before, or even sugar for that matter. And that's simply just because of trade. Native Americans, as well as the Sioux, would have had access to coffee for centuries. If they didn't get it from other tribes, then they would have gotten it from white traders. Just imagine this scenario. You're a fur trader and you're interested in getting some beaver pelts from your local Indians. You want to establish a good business relationship and start things off on the right foot. So what do you offer? A cup of coffee. Simple and classic. So I'm just getting this feeling that the movie's indicating that Dunbar is the first white man this particular band has spoken to, which is actually kind of impressive if you think about it, because how did they miss all the hundreds of thousands of white people crossing their lands during the California Gold Rush? I just imagine they would have made contact with someone, but I guess not. I mean, that's why we see another oh wow moment when Kicking Bird looks through a telescope for the first time. However, these inaccuracies are all relatively harmless compared to this next one. It's when the movie possibly suggests the idea that the Sioux had very little knowledge of firearms.
I have guns. Mazawaka, Ota Blue Hayela. Lila, Ota Blue Hayela.
At the fort?
Yes.
Akichita Ote Ekta.
Yeah, Lila Kayusa Yelo.
Mazawaka, Wanji, Wichasha, Nupi, Ipiki Yellow.
Okay, for the record, this is a really stupid moment in the movie because the Sioux were very familiar with guns. They had them, they used them, and they came up against them. For example, the Dakota Sioux were fighting a war against the US government in the Dakota War of 1862. That's just 1 year before this movie takes place. In this painting depicting the attack on New Ulm, you can clearly see that all the Sioux are packing heat. Not to mention the Colorado War, in which the Lakota Sioux played a major role, also against the US government. It was fought between 1863 and 1865. Just keep in mind that this is during the time that Dances with Wolves is set, and yet in the movie, Dunbar has to remind one Lakota warrior how to use a gun.
Shoot the gun!
It's just kind of patronizing if you ask me. Because what I'm trying to say is that the Sioux, like all Native Americans, were very familiar with firearms. Ever since the mid-17th century, guns have been the highest thing sought for in trades and raids. And after a few hundred years of fighting off European and American imperialism, I think it's safe to say that they might know a thing or two about guns. So, the next topic I would like to discuss is one where Dances with Wolves draws a little bit of criticism over its portrayal of the Pawnee. Some people make the somewhat understandable complaint that the Pawnee are made to look like the cliched villainous bad guys, whilst the Sioux are shown in a more favourable light. I personally think that one small reason why is because the leader of the Pawnee is played by Wes Studi, and everyone remembers his role in The Last of the Mohicans, where he played the villain Magua. Shut up. Anyway, the reason why some people complain is because in real life, the Pawnee were a much smaller tribe that was often being attacked and oppressed by the larger and more powerful Sioux. In fact, the Pawnee by this point were in pretty bad shape. Up until 1830, they were pretty isolated from European interaction, and as a result, hadn't been exposed to the host of diseases that normally came with it. And then in 1830-31, they were hit by a smallpox epidemic, losing at least one half of their population in one winter. Each time they made it through one epidemic, they would be hit again by another, dealing with smallpox one moment and then with cholera the next. And then if that's not bad enough, they were also being attacked by the Sioux and the Cheyenne and being pressed by the expanding American frontier to the east. To give you an idea of how bad their losses were, between 1857 and 1876, their population had dropped to less than 2,000 people. But as to the criticism that the Sioux are comparatively shown in a more favourable light, I don't really feel that's fair. I mean, the main reason why we sympathise with the Sioux is because Dunbar sympathises with the Sioux, and it makes sense because he's friends with them. We are seeing the Sioux through his eyes, and he only really met them recently.
A war party is going against the Pawnee soon, and I have asked to go. I sense that I made a mistake in doing so, but I could not bring myself to take it back. They are my friends, and from what little I gather, the Pawnee have been very hard on these people.
So what I quite like is that we don't see the Sioux openly lie or demonize the Pawnee to Dunbar in any way. His interpretation of the Pawnee are really his own without any given context.
Kicking Bird wants to know why you want to make war on the Pawnee. They have done nothing to you.
They are Sioux enemies.
And the last inaccuracy I'd like to get into is one that I didn't even know was one. It was only something I picked up during my research, and it actually took me by surprise. It's the very heartbreaking scene where Dunbar and the Lakota hunting party come across slain buffalo, where dozens of carcasses are littered across the prairie with only their tongues and hides taken, whilst the rest are left to rot in the sun. The images you see in the film are very authentic. Compare them against actual photographs taken, and it's exactly the same. Unfortunately though, Dances with Wolves jumps the gun a little bit, since it only takes place in 1863. Whilst the buffalo were hunted in fairly large numbers, it was only for their meat and not for their hides and tongues. Commercial hunting like this wouldn't take place until around 1870-71, when tanners discovered a new way of turning buffalo hides into usable leather. And by 1870, there was a shortage of leather needed for belts to be used in factories, and America's industrial sector had an insatiable demand for quality buffalo hide, one that led to their near extinction. The man you see in that famous picture, for example, Charles Rath, is sitting on top of 40,000 buffalo hides, ready to be taken back east. In total, he bought or sold more than 1 million hides and several carloads of buffalo tongues. So, knowing all of that, does this inaccuracy bother me? And in my personal opinion, no it doesn't. Even though the timing of events is incorrect by several years, the film is taking a great effort to authentically depict them and the devastating effect this would have on the Sioux and the Great Plains themselves. A way of life that existed for centuries for the Plains Indians was soon coming to an end, and we get to witness that devastation through the characters and, for a moment, reflect on how much worse it must have been in real life. So does this film take creative license? Absolutely. I think Dances with Wolves is trying to do a balancing act between showing the Lakota Sioux in their prime to when things started going really badly for them. And to put it rather obviously, the transition didn't occur in 1 year. It was a gradual process over many years. And aside from the gun scenes and arguably the portrayal of the Pawnee, I find many of these inaccuracies to be harmless. What Dances with Wolves does exceptionally well is its honest, authentic portrayal of the Lakota Sioux and, in some ways, all Native Americans. Throughout history, they've been demonized as bloodthirsty savages, and for a good chunk of Western films, they were the bad guys. And in Dances with Wolves, we get to see their side of the story, their version of American history, and we get to see them for who they really are, as human beings.
Nothing I've been told about these people is correct. They are not beggars and thieves. They are not the boogeymen they have been made out to be. I'd never known a people so eager to laugh, so devoted to family, so dedicated to each other. And the only word that came to mind was harmony.
Well, that about covers everything I wanted to say about Dances with Wolves. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you do. Now, normally, I would be wrapping up the review right about now. I've gone into detail about the history behind the film, I've discussed its inaccuracies, and given my personal take on why I believe Dances with Wolves is such a wonderful film. But on this occasion, for this video, I would like to change things up a bit and take this opportunity to explore the history of the Sioux that goes beyond the setting of the film. So for any of you who only wanted to see my review of Dances with Wolves and hear about its inaccuracies or even my opinion about it, then I think it's best just to let you know now that I won't be continuing any further on that. However, if you're still interested in learning a little bit more history, then please feel free to stick around as we have a lot to cover. So, where do we start? How about briefly when the movie ends? Don't worry if anyone who hasn't seen it yet, it's not a major spoiler. Right before the end credit sequence, we see an epilogue that says, 13 years later, their homes destroyed, the buffalo gone, the last band of free Sioux submitted to white authority at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The great horse culture of the plains was gone, and the American frontier was soon to pass into history. Now, understandably, Dances with Wolves is working within the constraints of a feature film, and doesn't have the time to explain why it happened, how it happened, and just as important, what happened next. The story of the Sioux obviously doesn't end in 1877. A lot more hardship was on the way, so for the rest of the video, I'm going to try my best to cover all 3 points. Let's begin with the why. Now, the United States government has fought many wars against the Sioux, and the roots of these conflicts can be found in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Around about this time, the Oregon Trail was in full swing, with tens of thousands of pioneers passing through the Great Plains every year. A fur trapper called Thomas Fitzpatrick knew the plains very well, and he feared that a confrontation was inevitable between the Plains tribes and the pioneers passing through their lands. In 1849, he sent word to Washington asking for a peace conference to be held in order to avoid possible bloodshed. Washington responded and in 1851 gave Fitzpatrick the authority and permission to negotiate with the tribes at Fort Laramie, the farthest military outpost America had on the edges of the frontier. Fitzpatrick then sent out trappers, mountain men, and even Indians out to the Great Plains to track down all the tribes they could and invite them to Fort Laramie. The call was answered, and in September 1851, more than 10,000 Plains Indians came. It was one of the largest gatherings the Northern Plains had ever seen, representing tribes such as the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, the Arapaho, the Crow, the Sioux, and more. In order to accommodate everyone and the thousands of horses they brought, the conference was moved 30 miles to the east at Horse Creek. There, the negotiations for the Fort Laramie Treaty would begin. What was ultimately agreed upon was that the Plains tribes would allow the wagon trains on the Oregon Trail to pass through their lands unharmed, and the military were allowed to build a series of forts along the Oregon Trail to protect it and patrol it. In exchange, the US government officially recognized the sovereignty of the Plains nations. Here is a map of the lands reserved for the Sioux. The treaty also stated that American pioneers would not settle their lands, and that both sides would punish their own lawbreakers when they wronged the other party. And that was it. The treaty was signed, the peace pipe was passed around, all seemed to be good, and there was peace between the Sioux and the United States. That was until 1854. 3 years after the Fort Laramie Treaty, an incident occurred that could have easily been avoided. It happened when a Mormon wagon train was passing near a Brule Lakota encampment, and a straggling cow fell behind. There, the cow was taken and eaten by High Forehead, a mini-Konju Lakota warrior from another band who happened to be a guest of this one. The Mormon settler ran to the garrison of Fort Laramie and reported the incident to its senior officer. Lieutenant Fleming, unfamiliar with the terms of the treaty, spoke to the Brule Lakota chief, Conquering Bear, and demanded that he return the stolen cow and turn over its thief to be arrested. Conquering Bear couldn't give High Forehead to Lieutenant Fleming since he was a guest from another band, so instead he tried to recompense the Mormon settler with several horses. The Mormon rejected the offer, demanding $25 instead. With negotiations going nowhere, Conquering Bear returned to his village. Then Fleming ordered 2nd Lieutenant John Grattan to lead a detachment of 29 soldiers to the Brule Lakota encampment to arrest High Forehead. After a series of incompetent mistakes from Grattan and his translator, things escalated, and Grattan's soldiers opened fire on the camp. In the hail of artillery and gunfire, Chief Conquering Bear was mortally wounded. Then the soldiers had to deal with 1,200 Lakota warriors and was slaughtered to a man. This battle was dubbed by the newspapers the Grattan Massacre, and it would spark off the First Sioux War, after which more wars followed. There was the Dakota War, the Colorado War, the Powder River War, and things finally came to a head in Red Cloud's War. After 14 years of bloodshed, Washington called for a new peace conference to be held, yet again at Fort Laramie. The reason why was because Washington wanted to prioritize the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, and recent Indian attacks alarmed them greatly. So just like how the 1851 treaty was set up to protect wagon trains, the 1868 treaty was pushed through to protect regular trains. However, this new peace would come at a great cost to the Sioux, as they now had to give up more of their land. The Great Sioux Reservation of 1851 would now shrink to this. The old boundaries were now classified as unceded Indian territory, but the Sioux still retained the right to hunt on them as long as buffalo remained there and the tribes did not interfere with the construction of railroads and travelers using overland trails. All the land within the Great Sioux Reservation, including the sacred Black Hills, would be recognized as sovereign territory, and white men were forbidden to trespass unless they were government officials. The Sioux were also promised annuities to be paid annually over the next 30 years in the form of food, clothing, and other services. The US would also provide teachers, carpenters, millers, engineers, blacksmiths, and a government agency to reside at the reservation. The idea behind this was that in order for the Sioux to survive, they needed to completely shed their nomadic ways and become basically civilized. So with the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, there was relative peace. But that peace would once again be challenged when in 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills on the Great Sioux Reservation. The United States by this point was suffering from an economic depression known as the Great Panic of 1873. Motivated by this, thousands flooded the Black Hills in search of gold, within clear violation of the treaty. Initially, the US Army tried to keep them out, but as more kept coming, Washington eventually decided that the gold was more important than keeping their word. So, in 1875, they offered to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux, and the Sioux replied with a resounding no. The Black Hills were the cultural center of their world, and, in the eyes of the Sioux, it was the last place in the lands they had left that still had true value. So the United States, not wishing to appear as the aggressors, made an ultimatum, demanding that all Sioux return to the reservation by January 31st, 1876, or be declared hostile. They did this knowing some bands wouldn't be able to make it on time as winter conditions restricted travel. These particular bands, allied with Chief Sitting Bull, ignored this order as they were scattered in the Powder River area. The deadline passed and Washington's conscience was clear, allowing them to declare war. In the late spring, the US Army launched a major offensive to force the Sioux back onto the reservation. In the first few months, the campaign wasn't going well for the Americans. The Sioux and their native allies, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, were an elusive enemy, and despite a few battles, the US Army was unable to achieve a decisive victory. But then, on June 25, 1876, in eastern Montana, a battle would be fought near the Little Bighorn River that would be one of the most famous in American history. A Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, a reputable Indian fighter, was tracking the movements of a large host that was believed to be 800 strong. With him was the 7th Cavalry, numbering up to 750 men. During a reconnaissance, he discovered a massive Sioux camp, but noticed that there were no warriors to be seen, only women and children. So seizing the opportunity, Custer and 200 of his men attacked the camp with the objective of taking the women and children as hostages. However, as the 7th Cavalry drew near on multiple sides, hundreds of warriors emerged from their teepees and attacked. Custer attempted to regroup his men, but was soon overwhelmed by over 2,000 Native Americans. Within an hour, Custer and nearly 270 of his men had been wiped out. This was to be the worst military defeat the United States suffered during the Sioux Wars. It can almost be described as America's Isandlwana, and much like the British in South Africa, their response was more or less the same. Months after Little Bighorn, the Sioux and their allies lost the war, and were soon back on the reservation. The United States wasted no time in taking away the Black Hills and even more Sioux land. For over 10 years, the Sioux lived on the reservations and were almost entirely dependent on government rations. The buffalo they hunted were gone, driven to the brink of extinction by white hunters. The land they were expected to farm produced little in crops, and by 1890, the rations they depended on would be cut in half, and the Sioux were facing starvation. It was a culture in mourning with its identity and survival. And then, in 1889, a Paiute prophet in Nevada called Wovoka created a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance that spread across the western United States, including the Sioux reservations. Wovoka had a vision and told his followers that if they performed the Ghost Dance, the buffalo would return to the Great Plains, that their ancestors would come back to life, and all the land that was taken by the white man would be theirs once more. Wovoka's following grew, and tribes throughout the West took up this ritualistic dance. Hundreds to thousands at a time would gather in massive circles. They would sing and dance for hours and hours until they would finally collapse from exhaustion, hoping and praying that with their combined voices they would be heard by their ancestors. Instead, they were heard by the whites. Farmers and ranchers living near reservations were terrified of the ghost dance and feared that it would encourage another Indian uprising. In response, the US War Department outlawed the ghost dance and persecuted any of its practitioners. When the ghost dance reached the Sioux reservations, the government sent thousands of troops to subdue it, including the 7th Cavalry, the same regiment that fought at the Little Bighorn. On December 28, 1890, the 7th Cavalry intercepted a band of Hunkpapa and Miniconjou Sioux headed to the Pine Ridge Reservation. In the band was 106 men and 252 women and children. The soldiers ordered them to make camp at Wounded Knee Creek. The next day, the soldiers had surrounded the encampment and ordered the Sioux to surrender their weapons. Dissatisfied with the amount of weapons procured, some of the soldiers went into the camp and started frisking the Sioux. One Miniconjou called Black Coyote was deaf and hadn't understood the order. When a group of soldiers tried to grab his gun, it accidentally went off. In the confusion, a few more shots were fired, some from the soldiers and others from 5 young Lakota who had been concealing their weapons. But in the next few seconds, things immediately escalated. The troops started firing their rifles indiscriminately into the crowd, along with 4 rapid-firing Hotchkiss cannons. Whilst the Lakota men fought back, the women and children fled the camp in panic, but even hours later the soldiers continued to pursue them. Some bodies would be found miles away from where it all started. When the massacre was finally over, the Lakota body count was between 144 and 300. Later, the bodies were piled onto carts and dumped in a mass grave. And to add the final insult, 20 of the troopers were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked the final dark chapter of the Sioux Wars, and over 100 years later, things still haven't improved. The Sioux reservations are some of the poorest places in the United States, where alcoholism is high, where life expectancy is the second lowest in the Western Hemisphere, and 80% of the people face unemployment, 14% of homes are without electricity, and 20% of households lack running water. All of this within the richest country in the world. Needless to say, the United States hasn't done much to help, only to recognize the injustices inflicted on the Sioux.
I know that throughout history, the United States often didn't give the nation-to-nation relationship the respect that it deserved. So I promised, when I ran, to be a president who changed that. A president who honors our sacred trust, and who respects your sovereignty, and who upholds treaty obligations, and who works with you in a spirit of true partnership, in mutual respect, to give our children the future that they deserve.
You know, brother?
Fucking fuck! Medics! Get medics! Get vehicles! Get medics! Get vehicles!
Okay, I imagine some of you knew I was going to be covering this. For the rest of you who might not know what is going on in these images, let me explain. In early 2016, a Texas-based energy company called Energy Transfer Partners began construction of an oil pipeline. The $3.8 billion project would transport oil 1,100 miles from the Bakken oil fields through the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and ending its journey at an oil tank field in Illinois. Now, the controversy really began when the original proposed route of the pipeline had it crossing the Missouri River, north of the state capital, Bismarck. But the US Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency that owns much of the private land in North Dakota, rejected the route. During its environmental assessment, it concluded that the risk of an oil spill could contaminate the city's drinking water, And as nearly 500,000 barrels of crude oil will flow through it every day, I'd say that is a legitimate concern. So instead, the pipeline was to be rerouted south, and began construction to cross under Lake Oahe, just half a mile upstream from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe opposed the pipeline's path for pretty much the exact same reason why Bismarck did. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Not only would an oil spill contaminate Standing Rock's water supply, but the pipeline itself would have to pass through old Sioux lands that contain sacred sites, as well as burial mounds. And the pipeline's path would entail their destruction. And since the very beginning, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe have said no to the Army Corps of Engineers, that they didn't want the rerouted pipeline to come near their land. Now, a lot of people who are in support of the pipeline are quick to point out that it's on federal land, which is private property. But those same people refuse to consider the fact that this all used to be Sioux land. If you take into account the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, you can clearly see that it falls well within its borders. And the Sioux never gave up its land. It fought tooth and nail for them, as the United States just kept breaking treaty after treaty and taking more and more land. And the discussion of whether their land was illegally taken is not up for debate. For example, in 1980, the Supreme Court officially recognized the illegal seizure of the Black Hills in 1877 and offered to compensate the Sioux for $105 million. To this very day, the Sioux have refused to take that money, saying the land was never for sale. Today, with added interest, that money is worth $1.3 billion. So, with what little scraps of land the Sioux have left, they don't want to see it be destroyed when there's an oil spill. And yes, I did say when and not if, because the oil industry has some of the worst safety records when it comes to pipelines, and it's because they are the ones who decide how to regulate themselves.
Right now, the regulations are, to a grand degree, left up to the industry to decide themselves. Every company has a different plan. Every company's looking at risk differently. So there's lots of wiggle room in how the companies interpret the regulations.
Now, I will admit that statistically, it's safer to transport oil through a pipeline than by lorry or train. But when they do break, a hell of a lot comes out. Let's take a look, for example, at a pipeline that burst in Montana's Yellowstone River that spilled over 50,000 barrels of oil in 2015.
Right now, rising waters are complicating efforts by ExxonMobil to clean up an oil spill along the Yellowstone River in Montana.
Whoops, sorry, my bad, guys. This is quite embarrassing. That's the Yellowstone oil spill from 2011, not the one from 2015. Oh, here we go.
In a story we're following out of Montana, a pipeline breach spilled over 50,000 gallons of oil into the Yellowstone River over the weekend.
That's the one. Sorry about that, guys. I just get them confused sometimes. Duh. But I guess it points out that lightning never strikes the same place twice clearly doesn't apply to oil pipelines. I mean, just check out the safety records for oil spills by Sunoco Logistics, one of the partners behind the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Sunoco Logistics is one of the most frequent spillers of crude oil among large pipeline operators in the United States. In the past 6 years, Sunoco spilled oil more than 200 times.
Sunoco's spill rate is so bad that it is more than 2 times the industry average.
Wow. I don't know about you guys, but I think the Standing Rock Sioux tribe have a right to be worried. But it really shouldn't just be them. If the pipeline bursts, it'll go down the Missouri River and affect the drinking water for millions of people. And no amount of cleanup from the oil companies is going to fix that.
We never recover all the oil. Somebody who tells you that's telling you stories. Good conditions, you get half of the oil that hits the water.
So here we have a pipeline being made by corporations with a complete disregard of sovereign rights, public safety, and cultural heritage sites. On September 3, 2016, protesters were mortified when construction crews started bulldozing sacred Sioux burial sites. Things escalated when the protesters crossed the perimeter fence and became confrontational with the construction workers. A private security firm hired by the Dakota Access Pipeline started using pepper spray and sicking dogs on protesters.
Are you telling the dogs to bite the protesters? The dog has blood in its nose and its mouth.
This video from Democracy Now! Went viral and brought a lot of support to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Thousands of people from all across America and the world made their way to Standing Rock to join the protest movement. Even other Native American tribes. For the first time in history, all of the tribes throughout the United States came together under one issue. Then on September 8th, North Dakota Governor Dalrymple held a press conference. He then activated the National Guard to support the local law enforcement, and boy did they both show up in force, fully kitted out in riot gear and armed with mace, tear gas, concussion grenades, weapons that fire both rubber bullets and lethal rounds, even driving around in armored, mine-resistant vehicles called MRAPs. And if you think that's excessive, in early January 2017, they brought out 2 surface-to-air missile launchers. Apparently, weapons that can blow things out of the sky is appropriate for protesters armed with prayer sticks and signs. So, I was watching this whole thing drag on for months, and I was just horrified with the excessive violence the police were inflicting on the protesters. As these mass arrests were going on, stories started coming in of Native Americans being marked on their arms with numbers, like in Auschwitz, and then confined to dog kennels.
Yeah, it was a large chainmail dog kennel for, over 6 hours while they didn't even actually charge us with crimes. After that, I was strip searched and then thrown into jail, and finally, late that evening, was charged with the crime.
Let me just say that I understand that this is hard to believe. None of this was caught on camera. I wouldn't necessarily have believed it myself if it wasn't for all the other shocking stuff the police have done, like abusing their power to intimidate journalists. For example, Amy Goodman, the Democracy Now! Reporter who filmed the dogs attacking protesters, was later issued an arrest warrant. This was under the charges of criminal trespassing and inciting a riot, which is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And have a look at what happened to this journalist, Erin Schroed.
We're basically on ACE property, which is the Army Corps of Engineers land, and we shouldn't even be up there. So we have every right. This is a sovereign nation right here. This is sovereign people's land right here. So.
Oh! Who the fuck is that?
You okay? Here.
Then there's also the case of police and dappled security shooting down drones used by the protesters to record on video what they've been doing. In this circumstance, their justification for this was that it posed a risk to their helicopter and was coming at them. Oh, by the way, before I forget, this is totally illegal, because legally drones are considered aircraft by the FAA and shooting one down is a federal crime. Now, you might be asking, where was Obama in all of this? Was he going to keep the promises he made just 2 years earlier at Standing Rock about upholding treaty obligations and respecting Sioux sovereignty? Well, he was mostly busy with the elections at the time, but he was able to say this.
I think the candidates aren't really talking about is the Dakota Access Pipeline. Is that something that you would consider intervening in? People have called for your administration to make a call.
We're monitoring this closely, and I think as a general rule, my view is that there is a way for us to accommodate sacred lands of Native Americans, and I think that right now the Army Corps is examining whether there are ways to reroute this pipeline in a way.
Right.
So we're going to let it play out for several more weeks and determine whether or not this can be resolved in a way that I think is properly attentive to the traditions of the first Americans.
Right, so whilst he was letting things play out, things continued to escalate in North Dakota, building up to a climactic showdown on the Backwater Bridge on Highway 1806 between the protesters and the police, when on November 20th, 2016, police used water cannons in freezing conditions, used pepper spray, tear gas, concussion grenades, and firing at protesters with rubber bullets, injuring hundreds of people in the process.
Cover yourself, guys. So just so everyone understands what's going on here, basically we've got 2 folks here on their knees, basically praying, and we've got cops coming over and pepper spraying for utterly no reason. Utterly no reason. That's what's going on here.
The worst wound suffered that night was by a Navajo woman called Vanessa Dundon. She had been shot in the face by a tear gas canister, and the retina in her right eye was completely severed. The standoff on the bridge continued into the next day, and the mainstream media finally began to pay attention when tragically a young woman called Sophia Wolanski nearly had her arm blown off by a concussion grenade. However, their coverage of the event was completely atrocious, as they had no journalists on site to investigate it and simply regurgitated whatever the police told them.
Authorities say they didn't use concussion grenades, rather demonstrators attacked them with makeshift explosives, even rolling 1-pound propane canisters toward officers.
What absolute bollocks! Look, we all know how trigger-happy the North Dakotan police have been. Do you think for a second that they would just use water cannons and rubber bullets if the demonstrators were attacking them with makeshift explosives? That would give them the justification to use lethal force. But CNN and every other major media outlet doesn't question it and isn't interested in the possibility that it was a concussion grenade.
Intentionally, a police officer threw a grenade that hit her right in her forearm and exploded right as it hit her forearm. There are many witnesses, and they have shrapnel.
There is no merit to that.
How do you know there's no merit to that? CNN just cut him off before he finished what he was saying. The father was just explaining that they found shrapnel in her forearm, which is an easy way to identify if it came from a concussion grenade or some homemade explosives. Hey, CNN, if you actually had some people on the ground you could, I don't know, interview the doctors at the hospital, have the evidence analyzed in a lab CSI Miami style, or, at the very least, have someone comb through litter on site and see if they can find any bloody concussion grenades.
This is a little bit what we picked up from the barricade. We got an instantaneous blast, one that's already been blasted, and we have a full one that they pulled the pin and they didn't even cut the tape. That's an act of terrorism right there. Get a good look at that. This is what blew up the girl's arm.
Yeah, because these edges are really sharp, man. Like, you could tell. You could cut yourself on that.
Yeah, and this one actually went in. Some of them blow
Watch how you're
outwards.
swinging that one. Let me hold this while you're swinging your hand.
So when those explode, these sharp edges pull open and then the lid flies off. So any of that could have ripped open her arm.
Just by doing a 5-minute Google search, you could find the make of this instantaneous blast grenade. And if you look all the way at the bottom, it reads, "Warning, this product is to be used only by authorized and trained law enforcement, corrections, or military personnel. This product may cause serious injury or death to you or others." So, unless the protesters have access to military-grade hardware, then I think the evidence is so far on their side. But the mainstream media can't be bothered to do some actual journalism and investigate. Hell, they can't even be bothered to watch the video they're reporting on.
Law enforcement sprayed demonstrators with powerful blasts of water. Police say demonstrators set fires.
What fires? You mean these fires? The fires they're using to warm themselves after being drenched with freezing water in -2 degrees Celsius? Well, I admit that it's kinda hard to make out this angle. What about this one? Seems pretty clear to me what kind of fires these guys are setting. Oh, and isn't it nice that the cops are trying to put it out? You know, whilst people are suffering from hypothermia. The only other types of fires being set were from tear gas canisters and concussion grenades. So anyway, despite the mainstream media's coverage, the standoff at the bridge went viral and gathered even more support for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. The biggest of which was a group called Veterans Stand for Standing Rock, in which 4,000 veterans turned up to the Achettisacoan camp. Their mission? To act as human shields and protect the water protectors.
And our question to the federal government is, where the fuck are you? Because we're here. And the indigenous people have been praying for months for the white father to fucking come. We want you to come now. Now's the time.
When I was watching this, I was on the edge of my seat because I knew that it put the Obama administration in a corner. Since Americans love their veterans so much, how would they react if American cops fired on American veterans? And how would American cops react to being faced by American veterans?
We have received very concerning intel that an element within the protest movement wants to exploit veterans with PTSD, arm them, and try to trigger their PTSD and turn them aggressive. Besides being horrible and wrong, it could be dangerous and deadly.
And you could be full of shit. Anyway, fortunately that confrontation never happened. On December 4th, 2016, the Obama administration and the US Army Corps of Engineers denied the final permit to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Instead, the US Army Corps of Engineers would undertake an environmental impact statement and look for alternative routes. At the Ocheti-Sacoan camp, the Sioux and the rest of their native and non-native allies celebrated. But unfortunately, this victory would be brief. As one president left, another took office. A president with a huge conflict of interest to see the pipeline be completed. As President Trump has major investments in Energy Transfer Partners and another company called Phillips 66, which owns 1/4 share of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And if that wasn't evidence enough, Trump appointed Rick Perry as the Secretary of Energy. He is a climate change denier and a former board member for Energy Transfer Partners. And then, on January 24th, 2017, Trump signed an executive order approving the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and was quickly followed by the US Army Corps of Engineers granting the final easement for the pipeline, skipping the environmental impact statement ordered in December. As of this recording, the oil has yet to flow, but based on the past, I'm truly worried for the future. Now, I'm guessing that some of you may be divided in the comment section as to why I've dedicated a good chunk of this simple movie review to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Well, as I see it, the history of the Sioux's plight doesn't end in 1877, nor does it end at Wounded Knee. It is unfolding as we speak. We are seeing history in the making, and it's largely being ignored. The Sioux have been fighting for their sovereign rights for over 150 years, and it's amazing to see that to this very day, they are still warriors of the plains.